All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to be starting a new series called Design to Code, where simply we're going to take a UI UX design, as you can see right here, and we're going to convert this into code so we end up with something like this here on the web where we can go ahead and actually interact with that design. Okay, so for the first video here, we're going to be taking this dark theme stats user interface and we're going to convert this into code. Now, the cool thing about this is we're also going to be integrating a plugin called Charts.js, which is a really cool plugin to go ahead and generate this chart right here. All right, so that's what we're going to be converting here today. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, to get started here inside of VS Code, we need to begin with creating our files inside of this empty folder I have right here. So the first thing we need to create is our index.html. Then we need our style.scss. And then finally, we're going to need to create our app.js here to hold the configuration for our Chart.js plugin. Okay, so the first thing I want to go ahead and do is create our basic boilerplate here with Emmet. And we're going to give this a title of dark. Let's see here. Why is that not capitalizing? Dark themed, and we'll say stats. All right. Next up, I want to go ahead and link our style sheet here, and we're going to say style.css. And then lastly, I want to go ahead and link up our app.js inside of the body tag here. Okay. So one other thing I want to go ahead and actually link up real quick is going to be our Chart.js plugin here. So let's head over to the documentation for this. So to get to here, what you need to do is, let's see if I go back a few times here. If you go to chartsjs.org, I'll leave the link down below in the description. You want to hit the Get Started option here. This will take you to the documentation. So to install this, we're going to actually click on the installation option right here. And you can see we're going to be using the CDN option here, or the CDN method. And we can actually get the script tag here on cdnjs.com. So if I click on this, which I already have it open, it'll take you to right here, and you can just copy the script tag. And then what we need to do is head back over to our index.html file, and inside of the head section, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this in. But we don't need to have these two other values here. The only thing we need to worry about is the src value. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these two. And there we go. That is going to be all we need to go ahead and do to actually get the availability to use this plugin inside of our file here. Now there's still one more thing we're going to need to do in order to use our graph plugin here, which is going to be our configuration for the graph. Now it doesn't make sense to implement a configuration before we actually have our markup complete. So what we're going to do is we're going to write up the markup for this component, and then we're going to get back to the configuration. So let's begin here with our container, or our div with a class of container. And inside of this div, we're going to have our h1, and the h1 or heading is going to say activity overview. And then next up, what we want to do is work on this stat section here, which we're going to align using Flexbox. So for the markup, what we want to do is we're going to have a div with the class name of stats, and then we want to create an additional div for each one of our stats that we have, and we're going to give this a class name of stat. Now inside of here, we're going to have a span tag, and this is going to hold the name of the stat, which in our case, the first one's going to be called views. And then the second one's going to have the actual value of the view, so we're going to give this a value of 17K. Now we can duplicate this down 3 more times, and then the second one is going to be downloads, and this is going to have a value of 447. Next up, we're going to have the likes, and this will have a value of 1.2 thousand. And then lastly, we're going to have followers here, which will have a value of 2.5, and that's going to be 1,000. Okay, so if we head over to our index.html file here, you can see we have our heading, and then we have our div with a class of stats. So next up, we're going to want to implement our chart. So if we head over to the usage here, what we need to do is, you can see by the documentation here on the usage tab, we need to actually create this HTML structure here with the tag of canvas. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to copy this, and then we're going to implement this into our HTML file here. And we're going to do this right below our stats div here. And a few things I'm going to change. is we don't need this width and height. And then I'm going to give it a class name to have it be something more relevant to what we're doing here, and we're going to give this a name of line graph. Okay, GRA, that sounds right. Okay. Now, if we head over to our file here, you can see that we have the canvas here with our class of line graph, but we're not actually seeing any information for this graph because we haven't set up our configuration yet. So let's go ahead and work on that so we can actually display this values here inside of our graph. All right, back on the documentation, if we scroll down a little bit, you'll see exactly what we need to do to configure our graph here. So inside of the script tab, you can see here the first thing we need to do is get a reference to our graph, okay? And then we're going to use that reference inside of this variable where we're creating a new chart. We're going to pass that variable here as the first parameter. And then for the second parameter, we're going to pass a object that is going to have all this information for the graph. And if we go over to the, I believe, styling, you can actually, I'm sorry, it's going to be the line. You can see all the data set properties you can go ahead and change for your graph. There's a ton of them here. I'm not going to go over all of these or really any of them. If you want to go ahead and customize your graph more beyond what we're doing here in this video, feel free to come over to this document and see all the different stuff you can go ahead and do. Okay, and then after this data, we have the options here, which is going to be the more customization for the graph. And as you can see here, the only thing they're doing is the setting the ticks, which is going to have a value or a field begin at 0, and they're setting that to true. Okay, now if you want to get more options or set more options for your graph, you can go to the styling section here, and you can see here they have all this different stuff you can go ahead and configure. You can do the grid line configuration, you can configure the ticks, which is where they're doing, I believe, the begin at 0. I'm not sure where that is, but here is all of the different settings you can go ahead and customize for your graph. Okay, so anyways, now to configure our graph, instead of me typing out this all individually or manually, I'm going to copy and paste in the customization that I have for the finished graph right here into our app.js. Okay, so what we're doing here is the only major difference is for the options, instead of actually defining this directly in this variable of my chart, we're actually going to create a separate variable and set that variable equal to the options here. Okay, now you can see here we have this variable of line graph options, and then we're setting our options equal to this variable right here. Okay, now this is a personal preference. You don't have to do it this way. I just feel it looks a lot cleaner and it makes things a little bit more organized. All right, so for our graph, I'm going to go over what we're doing here. So first off, at the top here, we're defining the line graph, and we're getting a reference to that using a document.query selector, and then we're using this variable here when we create our new chart. Now for the options here, what we have is I set the aspect ratio to 2.5. Inside of the scales object, we're actually going to customize our X and Y axes here. So what we're doing here is we're setting the grid lines to display none. Now if we go ahead and take a look with our configuration paste in, you'll see that we have this graph right here. Now what I mean by we have the grid lines disabled is if I turn these on, you'll see if that's true, we're going to have these lines that go across the y-axis, and the same thing would be true for the x-axis if those were enabled. But as you can see, these are both false, or they were. Okay, so that's what we're doing here with the grid lines when we set them to false. Okay, so for the ticks, this is going to reference the actual labels here. So if we go back to our configuration here, our documents, and we go to, I believe, the styling here, the tick configuration is nested under the scale configuration. It defines options for the tick marks that are generated by the axis. Okay, so what this means here is we're going to change a few things here. We have the padding, which is going to set the offset of the labels from the axis. So that's one thing we're changing. And I believe the other thing that we were changing was the begin at 0, which we seem to find here in the default options here on the y-axis. So what this is doing, if we actually turn this to true, is, let's see here, wrong way. You can see when we have this set to true, this starts at 0, and you can see we don't have this actually touching the very bottom because we don't have the initial first value here set to 0. So what it does when we have that set to false, it actually doesn't allow it to start at 0. It starts it at the lowest number that we have inside of the data, which is going to be 1. So as you can see here, that looks a lot better. Okay, and that's pretty much it for all of the options. And the other thing we have is we set the legend here to display false. By default, it's going to have a initial value of true. You can see the legend looks like this. So we're not going to get into configuring a legend here in this video. All right, so for our actual graph here, you can see we have the data object here. Inside there we have our labels, which are going to be this down here. Then we have the data sets, which is actually going to be the data we're plotting on the graph. And then we have the border color, which is going to be the border of the line that the graph is going to create when plotting these points. And then we have the point border color and point background color, which is going to be the point for each one of these dates here. So that's going to be set to white. And then for the border width, for our border color here, we're going to set that to 3. And then the fill field is going to set the fill for the graph. And I have this set to false. So if I set this to true, you can see here it's going to fill this in with a color, and I don't like that, and it's not part of our comp. So I went ahead and turned that off as well. All right, so that is pretty much our configuration. Hopefully that all makes sense. Now, if you want to go ahead and customize your graph a little bit more, like I said, you can go check out the documents. They have a whole bunch of different things you can go ahead and tweak and mess around with, but this is what we're going to be configuring for this graph. All right, then, so the final thing that we need to work on is our styling so that we can get it to look like this finished component right here. All right, so the first thing I want to go ahead and do is we're going to be using a Google font by the name of Molish. So what I want to do is we're going to choose the import method here this time, and I'm going to copy this import tag, and we're going to head over to our style sheet, and we're simply going to copy and paste that in. Okay, next up I want to do a reset on our document here. And I want to set the margin for the whole document to 0, the padding to 0. We're going to set the box sizing to border box, and then I want to go ahead and set the font family to our new style of Molish. So what I can do is just come over here and copy this from Google, and then we can paste that in right here. Okay, so if we save that and we take a look at the site now, you can see that we have our Molish font is enabled and all the margin and padding have been set to 0. All right, so next up what I want to do is we're going to target our body here, and we're going to start by giving this a margin of 30 pixels on the top and bottom. We're going to display this as flex so we can center this in the middle of the page, and then we want to justify the content to the center and then also align the items to the center. And we want to give this a min height of 100 VH, and we're going to give it a background color of 19162F, which is going to be a nice, is that the right color? 19162F. Okay, that's going to be a much darker blue. So we take a look at this now. You can see that the content is centered into the page, and we have our background color set. All right, so next up, we want to work on our container, and what we want to set here is we want to give this a max width. So we're going to do a mobile first approach, and then we're going to set some media queries to target the bigger versions. Okay, so we're going to set this to 90%, give it a height of 100%. Let's see here, 100%. We're going to give it a padding of 60 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 45 pixels on the left and right. We want to round this off, so we want to give it a border radius of 8 pixels. We want to set the color of all the text to white. We want to give this a background color of, let's see here, 201D39. And then we want to display this as flex as well, and then give it a flex direction of column. And then we're also going to put a box shadow on here, which I'm going to copy and paste in to save some time here. All right, so if we save this now and take a look, we should see that we have this slightly lighter blue on top of this, and it kind of stands out with that box shadow. All right, so the next thing we want to work on is going to be from the top down. So you can see here in our index file, We're going to work on the heading, then we're going to go to our stats, and then we're going to finally get to our line graph. All right. So let's go ahead and, you know what, actually let's do our media queries here so it looks a little bit better when we're working on this. So what I'm going to do is we're going to set a media query up here. Min width, and we're going to set the media query to 850 pixels. And what we want to do here is we're going to set the body to have a margin of 0. And then for our container, what we want to do here is we're going to set the min width to 815 pixels, the min height to 800 pixels, and then we're going to put the height also to initial. And that should actually make things a little bit better. Let me refresh it here. There we go. So that goes ahead and looks a lot better on our desktop version here. All right, that's what I wanted. That's why I wanted to go ahead and implement that media query, so it looked a lot better when we're styling this up. All right, so now that we have that in place, the next thing I want to go ahead and work on is going to be our H1 or our heading here. So we're going to give this a font size of 24 pixels, and we want to put a margin bottom of 60. Okay. Next up, we're going to target our stats here, which is going to be this div right here, which we're going to have all our statistics in. And what we want to do here is not the help. We want to display this as flex. We want to justify the content space evenly. We're going to make this have a flex wrap of wrap so that when it runs out of room, it wraps the next line to make it responsive. We're going to give this a column gap to put 16 pixels of, I guess you want to say, spacing between each one of our columns here in this row. And then we're going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid with a color value of 19162F. Okay. And then we're going to give this a padding around all sides of 20 pixels. And then a border radius of 8 pixels. Okay, now if we save those changes and take a look, you should see that we're starting to take shape here, but now we have to work on actually styling up these individual stat values here. Okay, so to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to target our stat. And we're going to say, first off, give us a cursor pointer. Then we want to display this as flex as well, but we want to give this a flex direction of column. We also want to give this a border radius of 8 pixels to round this as well. And we're going to give it a padding of 30 pixels on the top, 70 pixels on the right, 60 pixels on the bottom, and then 30 pixels on the left. Okay? And then since we're going to be adding a hover state to this, I want to add a transition here. And we're going to say 500 milliseconds ease all. Okay, so if we take a look at this now, it should actually look a lot better. We still need to go ahead and work on the sizing of the spans here. All right, so what I want to do next is let's just get the hover out of the way. So we're going to say stat, and then we're going to say hover. And what we want to do here is we're going to give it a background color of FF9A35. And then we're going to copy and paste the same box shadow that we use on our container here on the hover property of our stat. Okay, so if we save this now and we hover over this, we should see we get this transition, and that looks good. Okay, so next up, what we want to do here is, let's see here, justify content, space evenly, that's all good. Okay, so what we want to do is actually work on our spans here. So by default, all of our spans here, so we'll say stat span, and we want to give these all a color of B6, let's see, B2 DB, which is going to be a very light, I think, purplish kind of color. Yeah, I guess that'd be a light purple. And then what we want to do is target our spans individually. So we're going to say stat span, and we're going to use pseudo selectors here, and we're going to get span first child, which is going to be the actual title value, and we want to give this a text transform, and we're going to set this to uppercase, and we want to give these a font size of 12 pixels, a little bit smaller, and then give it a margin bottom of 10 pixels. So moving along here, what we want to do now is we want to target our stat span, and we're going to use the pseudo selector of nth child and say 2. And then in here, what we want to do is we're going to also say, you know what, we can actually reduce this and we can do text transform on all of the spans here. I just realized I could refactor this a little bit. And what we want to do on the second child here is give it a font size of 36 pixels. And we also want to give it a font weight of 800, which is going to be that extra bold we went ahead and selected from our Google font. All right. And if we take a look at this now, you can see that looks a lot better. All right. So everything is coming along nicely. So the final thing that we actually need to do is by default since we're doing a mobile first approach, what we want to do here is target our line graph. Now, the problem with our graph here is if we get too small, it looks a little weird. So as weird, I mean, it starts to get really small and it doesn't really make sense to have it anymore. So as we get smaller here, you can see everything looks good, but at a certain height, you can see the graph just doesn't make sense to display it on something this small. So when we're using a mobile first approach, we're going to have this not display at first, and then we're going to set a media query to go ahead and actually display this when it gets above a certain height. Okay, and I believe we're missing something like a margin bottom on our stat somewhere. Where are we missing it at? Okay, so actually that's going to be in our media query for when we're actually displaying and not displaying the graph. So I got a little bit ahead of ourselves here. But like I was saying anyways, we don't want to display this graph when it gets to a certain point because it just doesn't make sense and it doesn't look good. Even though it is responsive, you can see it just doesn't make sense to display it on screens this small. So let's go ahead and fix that, and that'll be the final thing that we need to do for this component here. Okay, so by default, what we want to do is we're going to set up our line graph class here, and we want to say display none, and we need to set this to important because by default this is going to get overridden by the plugin. So if we do this and we say display none, if we come back here, the graph will be display none. So we're going to set up another media query here to actually enable this when we get to a certain viewport. So we're going to say min width, and we're going to use a viewport of 450 pixels. So once it gets to 450 pixels, we then want to display our line graph. So what I'm going to do is copy this right here, and we're going to paste it in. And instead of saying none, we'll say display as block, and then if we go back over here, we should now see our graph once again. Now, the final thing we want to do is once we get to a minimum width of 450 pixels, we want to apply some separation from our stats container here to our actual line graph to obviously give it some space and not have them both touching here. So what we need to do is we need to go inside of our media query here and say, let's see here, stats, and then we need to put a margin bottom of 70 pixels, and that should go ahead and wrap up our styling here for this component here. Okay, so as you can see here, it looks identical to the version we had here inside of our demo. And then if we go and inspect this here on mobile, you can see that when we go ahead and get above or below a certain viewport here, let me go ahead and get rid of that, you can see that the graph will disappear, and then once we get back up again, the graph will go ahead and reappear. Okay, so that's going to go and wrap up the first video here for our Design to Code series. If you guys did enjoy, please leave a like down below and subscribe if you are new. And if you guys want to see anything specific that we convert from a design into code, just leave your recommendations down in the comments below. But anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next project.